There was a time when the sky moved, not with clouds, not with storms, but with wings. In the autumn of 1866, over the forests of Wisconsin, a single flock of birds passed overhead for 14 hours straight. Observers said the sun disappeared behind them. Farmers stopped working. Children ran outside in awe. The air trembled with feathers. Ornithologists would later estimate that flock alone held 3.5 billion birds, and that was only one river in a continent of wings. Walk into almost any forest in 19th century America, from Maine to Montana, and sooner or later, the light would dim. The sound would come first. A low rolling thunder, not from the sky, but inside it. Trees bowed beneath their weight. Branches snapped like gunshots. Feathers fell like snow. They were called the passenger pigeon, the most abundant bird in North America, perhaps the most numerous bird the world has ever known. 5 billion strong, they shaped forests. They fed predators. They fed people. They seemed as permanent as the seasons themselves. And then, something went catastrophically wrong. In just 40 years, the endless sky emptied. By 1914, the last passenger pigeon was alive in a small cage at the Cincinnati Zoo. Her name was Martha. When she died, there were no flocks left to darken the sun, no thunder of wings, no shadows crossing the land, only silence. This is the story of how 5 billion birds became none, of how abundance became illusion, and of what vanished with them. The sky once moved, now it doesn't. For thousands of years, before railroads cut across the continent, before markets demanded meat by the ton, before gunfire echoed through nesting grounds, the passenger pigeon lived among people, not as legend, not as spectacle, but as part of the rhythm of life. Across eastern North America, indigenous nations understood the birds not as an endless resource, but as a seasonal gift. They arrived with the massed crops, when oak and beech trees dropped their nuts in abundance. The pigeons followed the forests, and the people followed the pigeons. Harvesting was deliberate, timed, measured. Communities gathered squabs, the young birds, during nesting season. Nets were used. Poles knocked birds from branches at night when they roosted. It could look overwhelming, thousands taken in a single day. But the scale mattered. There were no rail cars waiting, no distant markets demanding supply, no preservation beyond what a village could consume or store. Hunting was local, and local limits are natural limits. There were seasons of taking and seasons of restraint. The birds were abundant, yes, but abundance was not confused with infinity. Knowledge passed down across generations carried quiet warnings. Take what you need. Leave enough for tomorrow, because tomorrow always comes. For thousands of years, that balance held. Predators fed. Foxes, hawks, wolves, bobcats, all relied on the pigeons when flocks arrived. The birds themselves shaped the forest. They consumed vast quantities of acorns and chestnuts, thinning tree populations in ways that allowed sunlight to reach the forest floor. Their droppings fertilized soil in dense nesting grounds. After they moved on, new growth followed. Openings appeared. Saplings rose. The forest regenerated differently because of them. They were not invaders of the ecosystem. They were engineers within it. When flocks descended, the forest shook. When they left, the forest renewed. This cycle had repeated for millennia. Ice ages had come and gone. Human civilizations had risen and fallen. And still, the rivers of wings returned each season. The passenger pigeon had survived because pressure never exceeded reproduction. They nested in enormous colonies, millions of pairs in a single forest, each pair laying a single egg. Each chick raised quickly in a system built on safety through numbers. Predators could not break the colony. Storms could not scatter it. Scale protected them, and indigenous harvesting, even when substantial, never broke that scale. The system absorbed it. The birds recovered, year after year, century after century. 5 billion birds did not appear overnight. They were the product of stability, of ecological equilibrium, of restraint. But equilibrium depends on something fragile: limits. As long as limits held, the sky continued to move. The balance between forest, bird, predator, and people was imperfect, but it endured. Then something entered the equation that had never existed before: distance without effort, demand without restraint, killing without limit. The guns had not yet begun in earnest, but they were coming, and when they did, the balance that had lasted for thousands of years would collapse in less than a lifetime. The forest did not know it yet. The birds did not know it yet. But the age of coexistence was ending, and the age of extraction was about to begin. By the middle of the 19th century, America was changing. Forests were no longer boundaries. They were obstacles. Obstacles to railroads, to telegraph wires, to cities expanding westward. Steel tracks began stitching together towns that had once been separated by weeks of travel. Telegraph lines stretched across open land, carrying information faster than a horse could run. Distance was shrinking. And with distance shrinking, something else was growing: demand. In growing cities, like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, millions of people needed cheap protein. Factories swelled with workers. Immigrants arrived by the thousands. Markets searched for meat that was abundant, affordable, and easy to transport. The passenger pigeon seemed to offer exactly that. 5 billion birds, darkening skies, impossible numbers. Surely they could spare a few million. What had once been seasonal subsistence hunting became industry. Professional hunters emerged. They followed nesting reports sent by telegraph. One message could mobilize dozens of men within hours. Rail cars were dispatched. Barrels were prepared. When a nesting colony was located, the operation began immediately. Nets the size of houses were laid across feeding grounds. Live decoy pigeons were sewn shut through the eyelids so they could not fly, tethered to attract passing flocks. Guns fired in waves. Sulfur pots were ignited beneath roosting trees. At night, choking birds as they slept. Clubs were used to knock them down by the hundreds. Squabs were taken by the thousands from nests before they could even fly. Entire forests became killing grounds. Birds were shoveled into barrels, packed in ice, loaded onto trains, shipped east by the ton. Newspapers bragged about the numbers. One Michigan operation in the 1870s reportedly shipped over 1 million birds in a single season. Markets sold pigeon meat for pennies. It fed the urban poor. It fed enslaved people in the South. It fed factory laborers. And it fed a growing belief that nature existed to be emptied. Hunting became competitive. Men boasted about how many they could kill in a day. Shooting into dense flocks required no skill. You could fire blindly and watch birds fall. Children were paid to gather the bodies. Farmers were hired to provide access to nesting sites. The economy adapted around the slaughter. This was no longer local. It was national, and the birds were no longer protected by scale. Their greatest defense Nesting in enormous colonies had become their vulnerability. Because once discovered, a colony could not hide. Millions of birds in a single forest meant millions could be harvested at once. There was no slow erosion. There were only massive removals. Still, the illusion held. Each time a colony was wiped out, another seemed to appear somewhere else. Hunters chased rumors across states. They believed the birds were inexhaustible. 5 billion is a number beyond imagination. No one could conceive of its end, but the math had changed. Reproduction depended on massive gatherings. Disruption at scale meant failure at scale. And now, for the first time in their history, harvesting exceeded recovery. Year after year, season after season, the flocks were still enormous, still breathtaking, still darkening the sky. But something subtle had begun. The spaces between them were widening. The intervals between sightings grew longer. Reports became less frequent, not dramatic, not sudden, just slightly thinner, like a forest, quietly losing trees. Few noticed. Fewer cared. The railroads kept running. The markets kept buying. The barrels kept filling. And the sky still moved. But not as long. Not as often. The age of industry had arrived. And the passenger pigeon had become a commodity. The balance that had held for thousands of years was now being dismantled in decades. And no one yet understood how quickly momentum can turn into collapse. For a time, nothing seemed wrong. Flocks still crossed the sky. Hunters still filled barrels. Markets still sold pigeon meat by the pound. The scale was so overwhelming that decline felt impossible. 5 billion birds. How could 5 billion disappear? People believed the pigeons were protected by sheer volume, protected by God, protected by nature itself. Newspapers dismissed concerns with casual confidence. Too numerous to ever be exhausted. It was said so often, it became fact. Abundance creates blindness. When something appears infinite, caution feels unnecessary. And so the killing continued. But biology does not bend to belief. The passenger pigeon's survival depended on mass. They did not nest in scattered pairs across the landscape. They required density. Millions of birds together in one place. The noise, the crowding, the synchronized breeding. It triggered reproduction. Without the colony, the system faltered. When hunters shattered nesting grounds, they were not just removing birds. They were dismantling the mechanism of recovery. Eggs were crushed underfoot. Young birds were taken before they fledged. Adult breeders were shot in massive numbers. Colonies that once stretched for miles began to shrink, first subtly, then noticeably. Observers in the 1870s began reporting smaller nesting sites. Instead of forests filled for dozens of miles, there were pockets. Instead of millions, there were thousands. Still impressive, still loud, but no longer overwhelming. Early naturalists began to worry. Some warned that continuous market hunting could drive the species toward collapse. Their voices were faint. They were drowned out by gunfire and profit. The prevailing belief remained unchanged. There are always more. But something irreversible had begun. Passenger pigeons needed each other to survive. Below a certain threshold, a number no one had calculated, breeding success declined sharply. Predators became more effective. Nests were easier to find. The safety of numbers evaporated. The strategy that had worked for millennia, overwhelmed the world, now required a world that was no longer patient. And as colonies fragmented, reproduction faltered. Birds flew longer distances, searching for each other. Smaller flocks failed to trigger nesting behavior. The system that once regenerated billions each year began producing fewer. Still, denial persisted. Hunters moved farther west. Telegraphs carried reports of another great colony discovered. Each discovery felt like proof of endless supply, but each discovery was followed by the same pattern: arrival, slaughter, silence. The illusion of infinity masked a dangerous truth. Extinction does not announce itself with a single dramatic event. It happens quietly at first, in percentages, in smaller flocks, in longer intervals between migrations, in forests that feel just slightly emptier. By the time alarm becomes urgent, the numbers are already too low. By the time laws are considered, the mechanism is already broken. The passenger pigeon was not declining because people believed it could not. It was declining because people believed it would not. And belief does not change mathematics. As the 1880s approached, the great rivers of wings were no longer rivers. They were streams, then tributaries, then scattered currents, still visible, still remembered, but no longer unstoppable. The sky still moved, but now it hesitated. By the 1860s, passenger pigeons still numbered in the billions. By the 1870s, pressure was severe, but the skies still darkened. By the 1880s, something unmistakable had changed. Entire states began reporting fewer migrations. Hunters traveled farther for smaller returns. Nesting colonies that once stretched across dozens of miles were now confined to pockets of forest. The decline was no longer theoretical. It was visible, but still, it did not feel permanent. People remembered the great flocks. Memory is powerful. If something was abundant yesterday, it feels abundant tomorrow. Yet the mathematics were unforgiving. Year after year, millions were taken. Railcars left forests loaded with barrels. Market hunting intensified, even as supply thinned. Competition among hunters grew fiercer. What had once required little effort now required tracking, coordination, strategy. The birds were adapting, scattering, fragmenting, but fragmentation weakened them further. The tipping point had passed, and no one knew exactly when. By the late 1880s, massive nesting grounds were rare. By the early 1890s, they were nearly gone. Reports shifted from endless flocks to a decent gathering, then to modest numbers, then to uncommon. In some regions, years passed without a single sighting. Hunters began shooting the last known flocks with even greater urgency, fearing that, if they did not, someone else would. Scarcity increased value, and value intensified pursuit. In 1896, one of the last large nesting colonies was discovered in Michigan. Thousands remained, perhaps tens of thousands, a fraction of what once existed. Hunters descended. Within months, it was finished. The forest went silent. By 1900, a boy in Ohio shot what is widely considered the last confirmed wild passenger pigeon. No ceremony marked the moment. No headline declared the end. It was just another bird falling from the sky. But this time, there were no others behind it. Scattered sightings were reported in the years that followed, unconfirmed, wishful, desperate. People wanted to believe that somewhere, deep in an untouched forest, a hidden colony survived. But forests had been cut, land had been cleared, and the birds that required millions could not recover from thousands. The collapse had not taken centuries. It had not required climate catastrophe. It had not required disease. It had taken roughly 40 years, from dominance to disappearance. The most numerous bird in North America had become rare within a single human lifetime. Children born under skies, darkened by pigeons, grew old in silence. And still, even in the final years, some insisted they would return. Nature had always replenished itself before. Surely it would again. But the system was broken. The threshold had been crossed. 5 billion. To scattered remnants. To none in the wild. The crash was complete. What remained was captivity, and one final witness to the sky that once moved. By the early 20th century, the passenger pigeon no longer darkened skies. It did not fill forests. It did not migrate in rivers of wings. It existed only behind wire, in zoos, in small cages. Scattered individuals were kept in captivity in the hope that somehow breeding might restore what had been lost. But the same biology that once required millions now refused to function in isolation. They would not reproduce in pairs. They would not thrive in silence. One by one, the captive birds died, until only a single pigeon remained. Her name was Martha. Martha, she lived at the Cincinnati Zoo. Born in captivity, raised among the last of her kind. By 1910, she was alone. Visitors walked past her enclosure with little awareness of what they were seeing. There were no vast flocks in memory for many of them. No stories of skies turning dark. Just a small, unremarkable bird in a cage. Slate blue back, faint rose breast, long pointed tail, the most abundant bird in North America. Reduced to a solitary figure pacing on a wooden perch. Keepers tried to stimulate breeding behavior long after it was clear there was no mate left. They could not recreate the roar of millions. They could not simulate the thunder of wings. They could not manufacture the colony. And without the colony, there would be no recovery. On September 1st, 1914, Martha was found lifeless on the floor of her enclosure. She was approximately 29 years old. No dramatic final moment, no gathered crowd, just a keeper entering the cage and realizing that the last passenger pigeon on Earth had died. Her body was packed in ice, placed on a train, shipped to Washington, D.C., where she was preserved and stored in the collections of the Smithsonian Institution. Smithsonian Institution. She remains there today, a specimen, a label, a reminder. When Martha died, extinction shifted from myth to fact. The passenger pigeon was no longer declining. It was gone. 5 billion birds, reduced to a single preserved form behind glass. There were no ceremonies across the continent, no national mourning. The world was on the brink of war in Europe. Industrialization marched forward. But in quiet forests across North America, something fundamental had vanished. No more shadows sweeping across farmland. No more thunder rolling overhead. No more trees bending under impossible weight. The sky no longer moved, and for the first time in recorded history, humans had watched a species collapse from unimaginable abundance to absolute zero. Not because it was weak, not because it was fragile, but because it was mistaken for infinite. And now, the forest would begin to change. When the passenger pigeon disappeared, the forest did not fall silent overnight. Wind still moved through leaves. Hawks still circled. Seasons still turned. At first glance, nothing seemed broken. But ecosystems are not built on appearances. They are built on relationships. And one of the largest biological forces in North America had just been removed. 5 billion birds had once consumed vast quantities of acorns, beechnuts, and chestnuts each year. Their feeding patterns regulated which trees thrived and which struggled. When flocks descended, They stripped forests of amassed crops in days. In doing so, they prevented any single tree species from dominating. They created openings. They triggered regeneration cycles. They redistributed nutrients through layers of droppings so thick that soil chemistry temporarily shifted. Without them, those cycles changed. Oak populations began behaving differently. Beech forests spread in patterns no longer interrupted by mass feeding. Chestnut stands, already under threat from blight, lost a major ecological partner. Predators felt it too. Hawks and eagles that once relied on the abundance of pigeons during migration seasons had to adapt. Foxes and wolves shifted prey patterns. Competition intensified among species that once fed freely during pigeon arrivals. The disappearance rippled outward, not catastrophic, but structural. The forest reorganized itself in their absence. And humans noticed something else. The skies were quieter. Accounts from the early 20th century began describing a stillness that earlier generations would have found unnatural. Children grew up without ever seeing a migrating column of wings. Stories from grandparents sounded exaggerated, mythic, as if describing dragons. But they were not myths, they were memories, and what had once seemed permanent was now only archival. Extinction is often imagined as the loss of beauty, but it is also the loss of function. The passenger pigeon was not just a bird, it was biomass, energy in motion, a force that shaped landscapes. Remove that force, and the system recalibrates. We rarely notice the recalibration. We adapt. We normalize the new baseline. Forests without passenger pigeons became simply forests. Silence became ordinary. This is how extinction settles in, not with a single dramatic collapse, but with quiet acceptance. The continent moved forward, cities expanded, agriculture intensified, industry accelerated, and the absence became background. But something else had changed too. For the first time, the idea of total disappearance had become real. If 5 billion birds could vanish, what else was vulnerable? The death of the passenger pigeon did not stop industry. It did not halt expansion. It did not immediately change the way America harvested its wildlife. But it planted something new: doubt. For generations, the prevailing belief had been simple. Nature replenishes itself. Wildlife is inexhaustible. If something declines, it will return. The disappearance of 5 billion birds shattered that assumption. Extinction was no longer a distant phenomenon described in fossils. It was modern, documented, human-caused. Newspapers began using a word that had once felt abstract: exterminated. The loss of the passenger pigeon joined other warnings of the era. The near destruction of the American bison, the slaughter of egrets for fashion feathers, the collapse of certain fish stocks. Patterns were emerging, and slowly, attitudes began to shift. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, conservation voices grew louder. Naturalists argued that regulation was necessary. Hunting seasons were proposed, limits debated, protected lands discussed. Wildlife was no longer viewed solely as commodity. It was increasingly seen as heritage, responsibility. The idea that government had a role in protecting species gained traction. Early game laws appeared at state levels. National parks expanded. Eventually, federal oversight would emerge in the form of agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But these protections came too late for the passenger pigeon. Conservation often follows loss. It learns from absence. Martha's preserved body became more than a specimen. It became a symbol, a warning housed in glass, a reminder that abundance offers no immunity. By the mid-20th century, the passenger pigeon was taught in classrooms as a cautionary tale. Children learned that humans had driven a species from billions to zero. Within 40 years, the story lingered in the background of environmental law, in the eventual creation of endangered species protections, in the realization that waiting until a population is visibly collapsing may already be waiting too long. The passenger pigeon did not survive to see the laws that might have saved it, but its disappearance helped shape them. And still, the question remained. If extinction could happen once, at that scale, could it happen again? Today, it is difficult to imagine skies darkened for hours by wings. Difficult to picture forests bending beneath billions of birds. The passenger pigeon feels distant, like something from a deeper past. But the timeline is not ancient. It is modern. Photography existed. Railroads existed. Newspapers documented it in detail. The extinction of the passenger pigeon unfolded in a world not so different from ours, and that is what makes it unsettling. The belief that something is too many to lose still persists. Too many fish in the sea. Too many trees in the forest. Too many animals across the plains. Abundance feels like protection, but abundance can mask fragility. The passenger pigeon was not rare when its decline began. It was dominant. It was overwhelming. Its population collapse did not require centuries of slow pressure. It required acceleration. Technology amplified reach. Markets amplified demand. Distance no longer shielded remote colonies. Speed removed natural limits. The same dynamics exist today. Industrial harvesting, habitat fragmentation, global trade, rapid transport. The scale is larger now. The tools are more powerful, and the thresholds, the invisible tipping points, remain largely unseen until crossed. Extinction rarely feels imminent, while abundance remains visible. It feels impossible until it isn't. The story of the passenger pigeon is not only about loss. It is about miscalculation, about assuming that what has always been there will always be there, about believing that nature replenishes without limit. 5 billion birds once moved across North America. Within 40 years, they were gone. Not because warning signs were invisible, but because they were dismissed. Today, we have better data, better monitoring, stronger protections. And yet, the question remains, how close must a species come to silence before urgency replaces confidence? The passenger pigeon does not offer easy answers. It offers perspective. Abundance is not immortality. And momentum, once reversed, can accelerate faster than we expect. The sky once moved. Now it does not. And that silence carries a warning